Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Russell Shorto, the author of Taking Manhattan, the extraordinary events that created New York and shaped America. He's written 8 books and is the director of the New Amsterdam Project at the New York Historical. Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Shorto.
Thanks, Evan. I'm happy to be with you.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. When you enter the northern tip of Manhattan, you may as well be a half a world away from the southern tip. Think of all that is in between. Inwood, Washington Heights, Harlem, the Upper West Side, the Upper East Side, Lincoln Square, Lenox Hill, and on and on. There are parks, there are gardens, Madison Square Gardens, subways, office buildings, brownstones, villages, Greenwich villages, schools, police stations, and numerous sites of international incidents, and of course, people, lots of people. Some live there, but most don't, depending on the day. It's not the largest borough by area or by population, but somehow Manhattan is the center of the world. Russell argues the roots of that import are found in how and why it was taken and by whom. So, Russell, which Englishman first noticed Manhattan had potential?
I guess you're referring to Richard Nicolls.
Yeah.
Richard Nicolls came, so the book takes place in a 2-week period in the late summer of 1664. The Dutch had founded a colony of New Netherland in the capital of New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island 40 years earlier. So they had had 40 years to build a society, a community. And belatedly, Richard Nicolls, a colonel in the English army who is sailing on behalf of his bosses, King Charles II and James, the Duke of York, his brother, comes sailing in, determined to take it and to make it his own or make it theirs.
When you are there, when you look at it from certain angles, it feels like it's massive, like it couldn't be any bigger of a place than it is. But it's only 13 miles long and it's 2.5 miles across. So I'm curious what geographic features it has that makes it the perfect fertile ground for an empire.
First of all, it sits in this magnificent world-class harbor, and the Hudson River runs north-south and flows down into that harbor. So what the Dutch already understood in the 1600s and the English later understood and was borne out by American history is the fact that if you're backing up now to the 1600s, or if you want, first of all, to get access to exploit everything that is in the North American continent, this gives you that. And if you want to be a kind of fulcrum between the whole world and the American continent, this is the spot. Because what would eventually happen with Manhattan Island is, because of this harbor, all the world's commerce, and for that matter, all the world's people, would come to this place, to New York Harbor, and from there go up the Hudson River. And after the Erie Canal was built in the 1820s, which made the Mohawk River navigable, so you go from Manhattan Island, from the New York Harbor, up 150 miles up the Hudson River, and then you make a left, you go west into the Mohawk River. That takes you all the way to the Great Lakes. So when that happened, when the Erie Canal was made the Mohawk navigable, all the cities around the Great Lakes spring into their industrial might. Chicago and Detroit and Buffalo and Erie and Cleveland and Duluth, um, and the cities that are at that juncture of those two rivers, Troy and Albany and Schenectady become these little powerhouses, and the city that was on this island in the harbor, Manhattan, becomes kind of the fulcrum between the whole world and the rapidly populating continent of North America.
Your book is about the second taking of Manhattan, the taking of it from the Dutch by the English, but the first taking of it was the Dutch from the natives. Um, how far back, even before these quote takings, how far back can we trace its social history? Who were the first people to control Manhattan and what would become New York City, and how did those people get there?
Well, the native people whose territory it was in when the Dutch came are called the Delaware or the Lenape or the Munsee. They're kind of interchangeable terms for them, which are overlapping terms. And their territory was basically the New York City region today, and then extending west into New Jersey and south to Delaware. Um, where did they come from? If you're asking the long-term question,
Really long term.
I forget exactly how far back, 8,000 years, something like that, Siberians came across the land bridge into the Americas. So they were presumably going way back, part of that migration. Um, and the interesting thing is that New York City, of course, became this crossroads once it was settled by Europeans and by Americans. But it was as well when it was populated by Native Americans. So I just said the Lenape people, it was their homeland, but Manhattan Island was used seasonally for hunting, not just by them, but by other Native peoples in the region. You had the Shinnecock and the Montauk on Long Island. You had others. So it was always, for some reason, I think having to do with what I was just laying out, the geography and the relationship of the water and the land. It was always a crossroads.
When you're a kid growing up in New York City and going to school in Manhattan, like I was, elementary schools giggle and giggle about the trade that was made. The $24 of trinkets for the whole thing, for all of this, and you look around and your teachers show you all these buildings, and they say, "Can you believe that this trade was made?" How close to reality is the myth that us elementary school kids giggle about in third and fourth grade? How close is that story to a reality, or was that a myth?
Yes and no, both. In the Dutch were so the Dutch came in 1624, and then 2 years later they decided, okay, Manhattan Island would be their capital, and they were sticklers about record keeping and about getting things in writing, even though they knew the native people were not. I mean, they didn't have a system of writing, although they did have systems of recording things. Um, and so they signed a deed with them, presumably with the Lenape people, for the island. They over the course of this 40-year period, the Dutch signed something like 600 deeds with Native people up and down the Hudson and along the Mohawk and the Delaware rivers. And the the crucial thing to understand is that the Dutch understood perfectly well that the native people did not have a concept of real estate and here's some money or some goods and we'll give you that in exchange for this real estate. They knew they didn't operate that way. Um, but they were also thinking of other Europeans. Like, what if the English come? What if the French come? We want to have a piece of paper to show, look, we got this fair and square. Um, at the same time, the Dutch would have entered into an agreement that was in accord with what the native people did. So they did value real estate, and they enter. What they would have done is entered into something like an alliance. So they would have, from their perspective, the native perspective, they were saying, okay, you want to come to this island, we'll let you come, we'll continue using it, but you can live here and we will get something out of it because we value these European manufactured goods, knives and kettles and guns and things like that. And we'll exchange for furs because that's what the Europeans wanted. And in recognition of this agreement, this treaty, there will be some gifts. And so they gave them, the Europeans gave them uh, manufactured goods, which in the 19th century were valued, first in the 17th century, they were valued at about 60 guilders worth of goods. And then in the 19th century, the translator who translated this document converted that to 19th century dollars, hence $24. That's where that comes from. So yes, $24 does enter in, but it was not by the people at the time on either side seen as the fee for the purchase of something.
As the English are, um, as the second taking of Manhattan is getting underway, if you can just describe what uh, sort of the populated area of Manhattan consisted of. What was daily life like? Who was living there? What were the main businesses? And what sort of sets the stage socially here for this second transfer?
Okay, so what I was just talking about was the first taking, and that allowed them, the Dutch, to begin building their city of New Amsterdam, which by the time of the second taking, 40 years later, had become this robust little settlement at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. So it was there were 16 streets. The northern boundary, they built a wall, and the street that ran along that wall became known as Wall Street. So if you have a sense of Manhattan geography now, that New Amsterdam is what is now the financial district. So that's the oldest part of the city. So it's only this tiny triangle of land at the southern tip that was the capital, and it was even smaller than that because the outsides of that today are landfill. Battery Park is landfill. Um, the couple of blocks along the East River are landfill where the Staten Island ferry terminal is. So it was this little tiny triangle. There were other people had bought land within the Dutch period on Manhattan. So it was settled to the extent that there were farms here and there. There was a small community further up the island that was founded in 1658 that they called New Haarlem after the Dutch city of Haarlem, and that of course became Harlem. Um, and that was really about it. There were not many. The New York once the English took over. Richard Nicolls, who we talked about at the beginning, became the first governor, and one of his first acts was to change the boundaries. So that little triangle that had been New Amsterdam, he said, no, this isn't good enough. We're going to make Manhattan Island itself New York City, and that's what remained New York City for a couple hundred years.
How important is it to understand who King Charles II is and what were his motivations?
Well, to talk about King Charles II is to talk about England in the 17th century and this incredible strife that English society was undergoing. So the Dutch who settled Manhattan uh, had built this vibrant, this was their so-called golden age. They had built this probably the world's foremost international global trading empire. And it was astounding and bewildering to other Europeans because they were such a tiny nation. But they had developed two things in particular. One, this notion of toleration, religious toleration, at a time when other Europeans thought intolerance was official policy. And the other was they had pioneered capitalism. And so those two things allowed the Dutch to build this remarkable empire. England, at the same time, was going through its civil war. On the one hand, you had the Puritans, who were essentially a religious cult who believed that all of society had to conform to their idea of what God wanted. And then you had everyone else everyone else is lumped under the term of royalists. Um, Royalists is a little bit misleading because it suggests they all loved the king and the monarchy, and many of them did, but mostly they were united in opposition to the Puritans. They did not want the Puritans to take over and outlaw Christmas and dancing and theater, which eventually the Puritans did. So, in the middle of this strife, the Puritans get more and more powerful. They capture King Charles I and they behead him. Uh, the civil wars ensue. Charles's two young sons, Charles and James, flee to Europe into exile. Eventually, they regroup, and Oliver Cromwell, the Puritan leader, dies, and they come back. The Stuarts family comes back on the throne. So they cross the English Channel, and now Charles II, the elder of the two brothers, is king. All of this history is behind him. He's very aware that they're aware of the Puritan um, danger, threat, crisis, which is still their country is still awash in, but they have now regained the monarchy, and they are now at this moment in 1660 they come back. They are really interested in catching up to the Dutch in dealing with this and in trying to build an empire of their own. And so one of the first things they do is they look across the Atlantic Ocean at North America, and they're thinking about that.
How do we start to see the foreshadowing of America? That's one of the things your book is about, is that it sets the stage for what would become our country. It's a land with enormous promise. There's diversity, there's ingenuity, but there's also this individualism and political division and seeming, upon reflection, self-sabotage.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that comes out of this period, and not just this period, but this story of this struggle over Manhattan Island. Because, um, as I said, the Dutch had in Europe they had established a society that valued toleration of religious differences, and religion was the great divisive force in the 17th century, the cause of many wars. So it was a real watershed when they crafted an official policy of religious toleration. Nobody would be investigated or persecuted because of their religion. And other European nations, England, France, Spain, thought that that was crazy, that you had to be intolerant. You had to have a state church because it was too dangerous. Otherwise, you were inviting anarchy. So this was a real innovation, and the Dutch made it work. And because of that, once you tolerate religious differences, you are opening yourself up to having a pluralistic society where people are going to speak different languages and have different cultures. So that was the case in the Dutch Republic. And when that society founded this colony, that all kind of came along. So in the famous statistic is that in 1643, someone reported that there were 18 languages being spoken in New Amsterdam at the tip of Manhattan Island, and there were probably only about 500 people living there at the time. So, I mean, it's New York is New York even before it's New York. The English aren't going to come in for a couple of decades, but it's already this intense mix of languages and customs, and they are somehow making it work. they're proving that in fact, and all these things are going to be a recipe for New York, but beyond that, they're going to be a recipe for America. If you put pluralism, religious toleration, and capitalism together, I mean, that's kind of what America is.
I love asking authors about how they write their books. So we'll get back to the plot here in just a minute. But I want to ask, you say that you love great characters to drive your stories in your books. I think some authors um, try to outwrite the characters. How difficult is it to go back now, coming up on 400 years, to piece together people who, you can't interview anybody who knew them, you can't interview them. The documents, some of them have been lost to history. The buildings themselves are gone, the streets are gone, at least what it looked like back then, even if the streets are still sort of mapped out in the present day. So, how hard is it to put together these great characters?
It's a challenge, but it's also the fun of it. In this case, you have the Dutch were meticulous record keepers, and they left behind what still exists is 12,000 pages of records from their 40 years in New Netherland, in this colony. And that I originally came to this topic um, 25 years ago when I met Charles Gehring, who was then, excuse me, translating that official corpus. He just retired in April of this year after 51 years. He's not quite through the 12,000 pages. There's another 1,500 or so to be done. Um, and that was just a whole world. He was translating and making these published volumes available, and that gave a sense of of what there was, and of the people, and you can get out of that their personalities. Peter Stuyvesant, the director of the colony for the Dutch, for the last 17 years of its life, uh, comes through. I mean, he's this very hard-headed son of a Calvinist minister. He comes into the colony in the midst of this turmoil. He tries to just lay down the law and be kind of a tyrant, and he comes to realize that these are the very strong-willed traders who are his colonists, and they're not going to put up with that. So it really becomes a very difficult time for him in his first years in the colony. And that's what I wrote about in my earlier book, The Island at the Center of the World. And so, he is very rich in those records. Richard Nicolls, his story is mostly in at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University and in papers at the UK National Archive. And he is his backstory. It was a lot of fun to unearth him because a lot of people, Peter Stuyvesant is pretty well known. Richard Nicolls, almost nobody has heard of, and yet he was so consequential. As I said, he becomes the first governor of New York. He takes all these steps that are going to set up New York history and American history, and he was so unknown. So I had to dig through information about his life. It turns out that he knew the royal brothers, Charles and James, from childhood, from very early on. When their father was still alive, the king, he was a big hunter, so he would take his young sons regularly to the royal hunting grounds, and they would stay in the lodge, the Great Lodge there, which was the home of the keeper of the royal hunting ground. Richard Nicolls was the son of the keeper of this lodge, of this hunting ground. So they all lived together every time the royal family came. So, I thought that was really interesting in terms of, because this is a really complicated mission they are then going to give to this man to take over this colony. And this, when you unpack his life story, you see how deeply connected he was to them and how much trust they had in him. So, you pull together, these are the main sources of information. There are many others. Um, and then you sit with them for a long time and you read and you start to people start to emerge from the, just the stuff of history.
How did you realize that this had to be two separate books? The Island at the Center of the World, which focuses on Dutch Manhattan, and then Taking Manhattan, which is the English taking it from the Dutch. At what point did you realize that this could be two separate stories?
Well, I wrote The Island at the Center of the World 20 years ago because I was just fascinated by this wealth of material in these Dutch records and what that said about American history. We grew up thinking American history starts with the Puritans and Pilgrims in New England, and it's a very English story, and it's this very religious story. Um, but I realized, thanks to Charlie Gehring's work, that you could just as easily look at American beginnings from Lower Manhattan. They were there at the same time, and they developed quite a different kind of society. It had this mix of people, and I mean, they were religious, but it wasn't just one religion. So that's already a more American story in terms of, who we are today. Um, and they gave so much to our DNA. So that then was the book I wrote, and I thought, okay, that's there's I wrote a book about the this largely forgotten piece of American colonial history. But I stayed in contact with Charlie Gehring and with this translation project, and starting about 5 years ago, I realized Charlie and the one or two other people who'd been translating were now up to the last year or two in this 40-year history of the colony. And in that last year or two, you see New Amsterdam now as this really vibrant, complicated place. And you see it more or less in the way that Richard Nicolls and the English saw it, as this, like, how are they doing that? How is this, this port in this harbor, how are they there? There's 1,500 people there at that time. Everybody's a trader. They're trading with islands in the Caribbean. They're trading with ports in South America. They're trading with West Africa, with different parts of Europe. And even with, like, the English in New England are sending goods, their ships, to New Amsterdam to to so that they will conduct their trade for them. They're better at everything. And how are they able to do that? So you see now that this is a moment, this transfer of this island. This is a moment when a lot of later American history is going to flow from it.
How does all this tie into your work at the New Amsterdam project? Are you able to do these side by side? And by the way, I graduated from the New York when I graduated high school from Beacon High School. That's where we had our ceremony, by the way, at the New York Historical
Oh,
Society.
really?
So
How
yeah,
interesting. Oh, that's cool.
I don't want to say 100 years ago, but it's 25 years ago now, which I can't believe. So how does your work with books intersect with your work at the New Amsterdam project? Are you able to do them side by side?
Yeah, I started in 2022 there. I started the New Amsterdam project because I realized that there was nothing, none of the universities or museums or history centers in New York had something that was kind of a standalone unit that focused on the Dutch period and all the things that flow from it, tolerance, intolerance, because we haven't gotten to it yet, but the Dutch also started the slave trade, started slavery in New York, and capitalism and all these things. So what I do there is different kinds of public programming. We did an exhibit last year called New York Before New York that was artifacts about of from New Amsterdam to kind of show people who was there and what things came out of that. I'm working on a big art exhibit for next year. So next year is 2026, the 400th anniversary of the founding of New Amsterdam. And we are doing an exhibit that'll be called Old Masters and New Amsterdam. We're bringing 60 60 Dutch Old Master paintings by Rembrandt and his contemporaries, uh, with the idea that as I said, the Dutch in this colony wrote a lot, but there were virtually no artists, so we don't have much of a sense of what it looked like. At the same time, however, Rembrandt and Vermeer and Frans Hals and all these guys were making this amazing art in Europe. So we're taking paintings from the Dutch masters that help us to get an idea of what New Amsterdam looked like. So they're interiors of homes, tavern scenes, market scenes, festivals, things like that. And so and then around that we do educational programming because New York Historical is big on educational. Um, so there'll be thousands of New York City school children who come in, stand face to face with the Rembrandt, stand face to face with some documents from the period, the Flushing Remonstrance, which we'll have on loan from the New York State Archive, which is the original statement of religious liberty in America. And then there'll be curriculum programming around that, so teachers can help kids to sort of make sense of all of this.
Awesome, awesome. I remember being a little kid and being like, "Wait, New York had a name before New York? What?" What are the documents or evidence that you wish you had but don't have? Is there something missing that you wish was accessible or still out there?
Yeah, I always think, you know, people like me, you spend so much time with documents and other artifacts, and you're just trying to get you know, I mean, you're trying to get details, but really you're trying to add up those details until you get, the thing, what it really was. And I always think, you know, if I could spend 5 minutes there,
Right.
then
Take a bunch of
I,
notes and yeah, right.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
just looking around, it'd be like, now I get it. That's what you're trying to do with all
Right.
these little bits of stuff. You're trying to piece together that sense of, here it is.
Um, uh, is there a particular thing that you wish was there, or is it just a sense of place?
Um, you know, the there are a lot of records, and the records are official. And even when we have things like letters written by ordinary people, they'll talk about details of, what the weather or the crops or things like that, but they did not talk a lot about sort of what was in their heart, the way people now would kind of unburden themselves. So that is a constant frustration, and that's where, as a writer, you have to infer, you have to interpret. And I believe that that's part of my job as a writer. I know other writers of history who think, no, you have to stick exactly with what facts you have before you. Um, I think one reason that people are reading your work is for you to take all those years that you've spent with this material and tell them what you think this might mean. Where is this going, or what's behind this? And I also think you have to tell them when you're speculating. You say, I think based on such and such, this is what he meant, or this is what was in his heart, or something like that. I think that's part of your job.
So back to the story here a little bit. I want to ask about trade and the economy. How did the East India Company, which played, of course, such a role in worldwide trade, how did that impact the takings of Manhattan?
The Dutch had this unusual part. One thing that was unusual about their system was they had two multinational corporations, the East India Company and the West India Company, which effectively they outsourced their foreign policy. So these companies, and it was of course wealthy people who were the main investors, and they tended to be some of the same people involved in the government. So there was an overlap. Um, and the Dutch East India Company uh, invented capitalism, pioneered the concepts of capitalism initially in the late 1500s and early 1600s around their business. Their business model was I mean, it's a very hazardous business model. You're going to send wooden ships all the way around the world. You're going to try to trade with the people there and bring stuff back and sell it at profit. But, what are the chances that's going to work, that the ships are going to come back, that they're not going to be attacked or whatever? Um, so they pioneered these concepts of shares of stock. So you're spreading around the risk. Anybody can buy a couple of shares, and then by the same token, anybody in society owns a piece of these big ventures of the day. So that was a novel concept, kind of structurally. It also allowed them then to begin exploiting like mad. The Dutch, I'm talking about Dutch tolerance. The Dutch were also pretty brutally intolerant in terms of exploiting the East India Company, different peoples in Asia, enslaving them if they didn't like the if they didn't want to trade, then they could using the military force them to trade. So that became wildly successful, and it became the economic motor that powered the Dutch Golden Age, and it allowed these the rise of art that was people buying art for their homes. Before that, in Europe, art was something that artists worked for churches or something. They painted religious scenes, but suddenly you have the rise of secular art and people interested in individuals who are wealthy and they're so proud of themselves. So then they want to hire artists to paint their portraits. So you have the rise of portraits as a genre. So many things flow from that. And that becomes so successful that then the West India Company is formed to do the same thing in the West Indies. The West Indies meant, if you're in Europe, basically everything to your left. So if you're looking at the map, so coastal North America, the Caribbean, and coastal South America, that's the West Indies. So the West India Company had the oversight of exploiting North America, and they're the ones, therefore, who founded this colony of New Netherland.
When and how does the second taking of Manhattan become official?
This takes place in 1664. It's a 2-week period, and that's really what I center on in the book. You've got Richard Nicolls and 4 ships, 4 English warships, packed with soldiers, packed with weapons and gunpowder, come sailing into the harbor. And he's pointing his cannons at the fort at the tip of the island. And Peter Stuyvesant, his soldiers, his townspeople are all there. They're pointing their cannons back out at these ships. And this is the standoff that takes place. And the remarkable thing, and this is really what I unpack in the book, is I mean, these two countries had been at war and they were going to be at war again. Uh, and you would think they would just start firing away at each other. But instead, and I think it has a lot to do with the characters of the people involved on the ground, because obviously they couldn't phone home or text home and get new instructions. They had to decide what to do. And in this 2-week period, they hashed out what I call in the book a merger. And they recognized that whether or not this was going to be in the best interest of, for example, the West India Company, um, for all the people on the ground, this kind of merger where they're going to keep the Dutch features in place. That's what Richard Nicolls promised he would do. But the Dutch decided they would give up control to the English. That's what creates New York. That takes effect officially the next year in 1665, and New York becomes New York.
There are two important stories to this that you make clear are also just as much a part of America as all the ingenuity and diversity and all the rest. And one is the dispossessing of lands from natives. That is an important part of the story. And then the introduction of slavery. So, how does New York become, you hate to say it, but the gateway for both?
Yeah, we talked about the first taking, and that's uh, uh, the Dutch took the island of Manhattan from the native people. And as I said, they negotiated treaties up and down the Hudson River. Initially, I think they uh, understood that they were doing things in the native way, and that is they were going to have a deed, but really it was going to be a cohabitation kind of a thing. But within a very short time, the power balance changed. And once that changed, the Dutch, the English, the French, I mean, this is the story of the American continent then, start to push the native people further and further west. Um, that's in the very broad outlines of the dispossession of native peoples. Um, uh, the first enslaved Africans arrived. Slavery was not part of the business model of New Netherland. However, throughout this whole period, the Dutch had been fighting a war of independence against the Spanish Empire. It ended up being called the 80 Years' War. That's how long it took. So right after they established the city of New Amsterdam, a Dutch ship in the Caribbean captures a Portuguese ship that was allied with Spain, and there were Africans on it who had already been enslaved. They take them aboard. They had heard, presumably, about this new settlement the Dutch had on this island in North America. So they sail up the coast and drop them off there. So a year after New Amsterdam is founded, there's 22 Africans there, and they become the property of the Dutch West India Company. That's the beginnings of slavery in New York. Um, uh, for most of the life of the Dutch colony, slavery is kind of an ad hoc thing. It's not part of what they're doing, but there are slaves there. The numbers were small until the very end. At the very end, um, the first shipment of 290 men, women, and children from Africa arrives in New York Harbor, and it gets there 2 weeks before Richard Nicolls shows up. So, and they get off the ship and they're kind of stumbling around in New York, I mean, in Manhattan. And they're part of this scene as Peter Stuyvesant is trying to deal with, oh, here come these English ships. What are we going to do? Are we going to fight? And he's got his whole population and all of his soldiers. And he's also at the same time worried about what's going on to the north with the Mohawk Indians. And, so there are a lot of, there's this very confused picture. And in the midst of it, is what you would have to call the beginnings of slavery as an industry.
Not to gloss over, 100 years of history here from the 1660s to the 1760s and 70s, but how did the taking of Manhattan start to position New York as this crucial stage in the what would become the Revolutionary War? How do we make that bridge from, I realize I'm asking you about a century of history here, but eventually New York becomes a critical point here where the British are trying to fend off the colonists, or the revolutionaries. So, how important is the taking of Manhattan to this what would become the maybe the critical battle, or at least one of the critical battles on the early part of the Revolutionary War?
Yeah. Well, the taking of Manhattan becomes important in a broad sense because if it hadn't happened, I mean, just think. So, first of all, this Dutch colony is not just Manhattan, not just New York City. New Netherland, that the Dutch controlled for 40 years, encompassed parts of 5 future states. New York, most of New Jersey, Delaware, some of Pennsylvania, some of Connecticut. So it was this huge swath of territory. Had that not happened, had the English not taken it, would there even have been an American Revolution? There would have been the English colonies in New England, you would have had the English colonies to the south, Maryland, Virginia, and then you would have had this Dutch colony. So would they have ever, allied in that way? The taking of Manhattan allowed for the so-called original 13 English colonies. So out of that, as I say, comes not just New York, but New Jersey, and then this reconstitution of these other colonies that become states. Um, the Battle of New York became a linchpin in the Revolutionary War. We're 100 years later now. Um, I mean, it had become an important city, but more than that, both sides knew that the Hudson River was vitally important because that kind of divided the colonies. You could look at, New England to the north of it and everything else to the south. And uh, and again, New York Harbor and Manhattan Island are there. I mean, that kind of geography is so important. So Washington, as the leader of the American forces, desperately wants to hold Manhattan. The British desperately want to take it, and Washington amasses his army in on Manhattan. The British amass their fleet at Staten Island, and then they make their big invasion. And then Washington has to do his sort of evasive maneuvers through Brooklyn and Manhattan and going up Manhattan, and then eventually he runs
Yeah,
away.
hold
He
on. We're
has
not
to.
ready for this
Uh,
yet. Hang on. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And then so that geography speaks the same geography that caused the Dutch to be so interested in Manhattan century before is also what made Manhattan so important in the Revolution.
How and why did this story just get swallowed up by everything that came after in New York?
Because history is written by the winners, and nobody, after Richard Nicolls took over and he named New York, New York, um, nobody said, "Oh, let's stop and write the history of everything that came before and make sure we have it all down and we understand, what we owe to the Dutch or anything like that." I mean, they kept all those records, which is why I was able to write my book. Um, but uh, but that the first printing presses in America were in New England. The first books were written by the sons of the Puritans and Pilgrims who had settled the English colonies. And they told the story of their fathers and their mothers and what great people they were. And so that then sets this template of kind of America as the Puritan promised land. And so that taking that one Puritan, this little religious sect in England, and making them the kind of progenitors of America. And for so long, we've lived with that myth as our foundation, when in fact, I think the story is much richer.
After its founding period, what period of New York do you think is most interesting? The Billy the Butcher years have been captured in film. Boss Tweed is, of course, a massive figure. The Civil War era was fascinating. The Progressive era is fascinating. The 70s, of course. The Giuliani 90s, post 9/11.
Yeah, you're really
Is there a
that's a
period
hard
that
this menu of options there. Those are
yeah,
all pretty intriguing. I thought, I mean, almost any period is encapsulated by kind of almost like cartoon image. And then once you unpack it, it becomes much richer. Take Boss Tweed, for example. He is this iconic corrupt boss. Um, the historian Leo Hershkowitz wrote a biography of him, I think in the late 70s, that was really, if you read it, it's really kind of turns everything on its head for you because he portrays New York at that time in the 19th century as, by this time you have the great waves of migrants come from Europe, and so many of them take up residence in New York, filling up the boroughs and ghettos and barrios and it's and there is no social safety net. The FDR and the New Deal, all that stuff is far in the future. Um, uh, and so what he promises is he'll help people who are, these masses of people who are struggling. And in fact, he did help. He provided some social support to them. And along the way, yeah, he did it through corrupt means. But much of that corruption, according to Hershkowitz, is um, is what was pinned on him by his political enemies and played up. So, it's also possible to look at many of these eras in New York, or for that matter, in American history. Uh, Once you get down into it, it always gets much more complicated and more interesting.
Do you have a favorite New York song?
No one has ever asked me that. What's your
It took me
favorite New
40
York song?
minutes. I finally got the one no one ever asked you.
Yeah, right. Yeah. It'll probably be a Lou Reed song.
Do you have a favorite New York movie?
Favorite? I'm not good at favorites, but what's your favorite New York movie?
That's a good question. Boy, I didn't
Yeah,
think
it's
about
your
the
question.
answers for me.
Yeah.
Boy, now I have to think about that. My favorite New York
Okay,
movie.
so you stumped us
I stumped
both.
myself.
Yeah,
Well, my
when my
favorite New
we
York
my
TV
kid.
show would be Seinfeld.
Okay, well that's easy.
That's too easy, I guess, right? But I am
Yeah.
Seinfeld, so come on. I guess I'm more Larry David than Seinfeld. Um, w- who is your favorite mayor to think about in city history? Not necessarily the best or one you agreed with, but one who's most interesting and important.
If you're maybe Giuliani,
Hmm.
because look at the twists and turns. If you're looking at character, I mean, for goodness sake, there's there's a character for you.
Is there something that foreshadows the difficulty? Let's take your period here in the 1660s and you know early America here. Is there something that foreshadows New York's difficulty in finding a good mayor and a good leader? I mean, these guys just get beaten up day in and day out,
Yeah,
and they're in
well,
the middle
no,
of a
that
search
that
for another one.
yeah, that totally goes all the way back to the beginning because, as I said, New York was founded before it was New York. New Amsterdam was a mix, and this points to what the Dutch thought you could do, but other people said no, you can't, and that is undergird your society with a mix of different peoples who, by definition, are not on the same page, who speak different languages and have different faiths and different beliefs. Um, and they have proved that you can do that. At the same time, they have proved that it is always going to be trouble because what you have with New York, you have the birth in America of factions, and that's the essence of politics. Bringing these different factions, like how many of them can I bring into alignment? The Dutch government right now has recently collapsed because they have a political system with about a dozen parties, and you have to pull together a coalition to get a government. And if one party in the coalition pulls out, which is what just happened, the government collapses. You have to go back to the drawing board, go back to the voters, and pull together a new coalition. New York is factions and coalitions, and that's in its DNA.
Have you been able to pin down what has mesmerized people from around the world, including the characters in your story about New York to this day?
I think it's something in the energy that comes from all of the above. That essential, meaning in its essence, it's a mix of different peoples and and capitalism and money and promise and exploitation. And it's this island that is built around that 17th century was the great era of colonialism, of let's just exploit other peoples and grab things and make money from it. I mean, it's in all of that is in the DNA of New York, which is there's a lot of power, a lot of energy in that.
I just thought of I don't want to say it's my favorite New York movie, but I also don't want to say it's not my favorite New York movie, and that would be Home Alone 2. But there are
Okay,
great
how about
scenes in
this
it.
one? Okay, yeah. Now that you said that, in some bizarre way, that sparked me. Serpico,
Never heard of it or I've not seen it. So,
Serpico, Al Pacino,
all right.
or Dog. Here's another Dog Day Afternoon.
There you go. Okay, that's
Dog Day
good.
Afternoon. Great
Your book is
Manhattan.
dedicated to Saul and Vienne.
Vienna, those are my
Vienna?
grandchildren.
Your grandchildren. Any particular reason? Any reason you wanted to say this was dedicated to them?
Because they had just been born over the past year when the book was coming out. And I thought, wow, I've got grandchildren and, this is history and here's the future. And, it just seemed right.
There you go. And then have you decided what's next at this point? Is there a third inflection point now that you've done the two takings?
I do have I'm probably not the next book I write, but maybe the one after. I've got some rough ideas for a book that would be about sort of the next period of New York history, maybe from like the 1680s to the 1730s or something like that. Uh, where I mean, it's, picking up on what we were just talking about, all these themes and the inequalities and the staggering wealth and exploiting and slavery. I mean, it's getting into the Wild West there.
All right. Russell Shorto, the author of Taking Manhattan, The Extraordinary Events That Created New York and Shaped America. Thank you so much for being here.
Evan, thanks so much, and thanks for what you're doing. This is a great outlet you've got.
I appreciate that. That's nice of you. Check out the book and also his website at russellshorto.com. He's on the website formerly known as Twitter at Russell Shorto. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.